Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. As you heard, my name's Ben. In stark contrast to much of the intellectual and indeed musical prowess you've witnessed over the last 2 days, I specialize in dragging heavy things around cold places. On May the 11th, 2004, I was standing alone at the geographic North Pole. That's the very top of the world. If you spin a globe, it spins on the two geographic poles. So I was standing at the axis of the Earth's rotation. It's where the lines of longitude converge, so every direction was south, no matter which way I turned. All the time zones converge at the North and South Pole, so it could have been any time that I wanted, and indeed it was every time at the same time. It was 24-hour daylight. It's a peculiar place. I was the only human being, and I've had to work this out because I normally do this in miles, and I've worked out in metric. I was the only human being in 14 million square kilometers, which is an area 1.5 times the size of the United States. I'd walked there on my own from the north coast of Russia, a journey that took me some 10 weeks, 72 days on my own, camping on the frozen surface of the Arctic Ocean. And in getting there became the third in history to ski solo to the North Pole from any route. Interestingly, this was 6 years ago. No one's done it since. So there are still only 3 of us in an age when this year more than 5,000 people now have climbed Everest. Indeed, more than 500 have been into space. How come only 3 of us have done this? Well, the first reason is it's a pretty daft thing to do. Everyone knows where the North Pole is nowadays, so clearly I'm not exploring in the Edwardian sense of the word. I'm not skiing along, drawing maps and naming mountain ranges. That's all been done, really. And the second reason this is such a small club is that it's quite a challenging thing to do at times. It is relatively chilly. Minus 48 degrees C was the lowest ambient air temperature. A wind chill, theoretically, of minus 70 or minus 80 degrees C on some days. The North Pole is also in the middle of the sea, so to get there you've got to walk over this frozen crust of pack ice that is floating on the Arctic. So there are no maps. It's a journey that's getting harder year on year as the pack ice thins, 40% thinner in the last 40 years. And to top it all off, I was camping alone for 10 weeks in the natural habitat of the world's largest land-based carnivore, the polar bear. So it doesn't have a lot to recommend it as a sort of gap year destination. So I'm going to preempt the 3 most common questions that usually occur at this point. The first one is why? And I'm not going to answer these now, but I just want to sow these seeds, and I'll come back to them towards the end. The second question is, Ben, how on earth do you go to the toilet at minus 48 degrees C? Again, you've not recently had lunch, so I'm not going to answer that right now, but I will, if I have time, go into some technical detail at the end. The third question I'm often asked is what's next? How do you top that? I was 26 when I reached the North Pole solo. There are, of course, only 2 poles to walk to. I'd broken a couple of records and a little bit concerned that I had peaked a little too soon in my career. So how on earth do you top that? Well, I'll give you a sneak preview of what I'm doing next at the very end of my talk. But the high Arctic, and particularly the Arctic Ocean, as I said, this 14 million square miles of sea has become something of an obsession of mine over the last decade. I've spent now 2% of my entire life sleeping in a tent inside the high Arctic, the Arctic Circle. And I'm going to talk to you about one particular expedition, which was in 2004. My harebrained scheme was to walk right across the top of the world, to walk alone across the Arctic Ocean, starting from the north coast of Russia, which is at the sort of top of the red line, top right-hand side, to the North Pole, which is somewhere in the middle, and then to carry on to the north coast of Canada. 2 Norwegians had made this journey as a team back in 2000. It took them 109 days. They ran out of food a week before they reached the Canadian coastline. There was a doctor in the little ski plane that picked them up. He described them both as being 48 hours away from death. They had pushed themselves to their absolute limits, physiologically and probably psychologically as well. Now, I never told my mum about that, but this is what I decided I was going to have a go at, partly because a lot of experts were saying it was impossible, and that intrigued me. This became, to me, like the 4-minute mile of the polar world. Now, I don't think I had lost my mind completely. I knew I couldn't succeed by being somehow tougher than these 2 Norwegians. So instead I had to innovate. We spent the best part of 3 years preparing, training for this project. Some huge innovations along the way. This is me with my food. We took a radical departure to the conventional high-fat polar diet. So that's me with 95 days of food, much higher carbohydrate, much higher protein, much more like any other endurance athlete would eat nowadays, a Tour de France cyclist or an ultramarathon runner. And the journey started quite sensibly. I had a big support team flying with me out through Russia, a film crew. We flew British Airways to Moscow, that was fine. From Moscow to Krasnoyarsk, where there's this sort of right angle in our route, we flew on a Russian airline. I don't know if you can see that at the back, but it was pronounced Crash Air. From Krasnoyarsk in mid-Siberia up to the north coast of Siberia. No one really wants to fly there, so we chartered this pretty elderly Tupolev. We've stopped here on a frozen lake to refuel. You'll note the two guys next to the fuel truck were both smoking at the time. And the stray dog looking up the steps came with us for the rest of the flight. And the Russian pilot, before we took off, assured us that the next leg of this flight would take 6 hours if we live. We made it, luckily, to Katanga. This is on the north coast of Siberia, one of the most peculiar places I've ever visited. I think the joke is, Katanga isn't the end of the world, but you can see it from there. It was minus 42 degrees C when we landed. This is as light as it gets in mid-February. This is midday. The yellow blob on the top right of the screen, just above the horizon, is the sun. It would come up about 11:30, set at about 2:30 in the afternoon, and the rest of the time it was pitch black and extremely cold. We were delayed by the weather for a few days, finally flew further north by helicopter. There we go. We had two of these pretty ancient ex-military Russian helicopters flying in tandem for 5 hours up to the northernmost tip of this string of islands, Severnaya Zemlya, heading out off the north coast of Russia. And this was the view from my helicopter as we came into land behind the first one. And we had two for safety reasons, really. This is when I was a kid, I dreamt of being an astronaut. That was my sort of the 7-year-old Ben's daydream. And I often think perhaps these trips have become a relatively low-budget way of getting the same sort of kicks. And I remember looking out of the window, this looked and felt like a different planet. I've never encountered an environment that is as viscerally hostile and unwelcoming. There's nothing really living out there. It feels like you're not supposed to be there. It feels on a bad day like this place is trying to kill you. And I think that's part of the thrill of it for me. I feel like a little astronaut. I'm traveling on foot, dragging this sledge behind me, my life support system, and that enables me to survive in these places for weeks and indeed months at a time. Both helicopters landed. We had half an hour to unload all my kit, make sure my sledge was packed. Clearly you don't want to forget anything important. We did some photography, some filming, said goodbye to my friends. The pilot did that. Everyone else climbed back in the door. Wham! The door slid closed. The rotors started to turn, and I was alone. In fact, that was the last photo that was taken of me out of the door of the helicopter. And I don't think words will ever quite do that moment justice. This project had taken, again, probably 2 years really to put together, an enormous amount of money, huge team in the background that I was coordinating. We had logistics people in Russia and in Canada and the UK and South Africa, all over the world. And I've been so busy training 20 hours a week, putting this, getting fit enough, so busy that I hadn't taken a minute to step back and reflect on the enormity and perhaps the stupidity of what I was about to attempt. And it hit me right then. The only thing I can remember was having to stop myself running up to the helicopter before it lifted off and banging on the door and saying, look, guys, actually, I haven't thought this through. I suddenly felt very small, very frightened, utterly petrified, completely out of my depth. What an idiot. What was I thinking? I was expecting to be out there for 3 months, on my own, in arguably the most hostile environment on the planet. What an idiot. You can see I've got 2 sledges there. I had 95 days of food and fuel. I'd become obsessive about saving weight, so I'd cut the labels out of my clothes, I'd cut the handle off my toothbrush, the food is all freeze-dried. I decided to take 1 spare set of underwear for 3 months. And despite such extreme measures, I was still pulling 180 kilos, so twice as much as I weighed. And pulling that is, as you'd imagine, pretty difficult. Now, if I'm showing off to a photographer, as I am here, next to the helicopter, I could just about move them. If the ice was flat, I could just about move them. But if the ice wasn't flat, I didn't have a chance. This is called a pressure ridge. This is the most common obstacle I would come across, and dozens of these things every single day. When you get close to the Arctic Ocean, you realize that it's not this single sort of white crust that you often see on maps, or perhaps if you've seen Al Gore's film, you'll see this big white sort of sheet. When you get close to it, you realize it's like a pond with lots of giant white lily pads. There are lots of sheets of ice called pans, and they're all drifting around, and they're subject to some huge forces. So the currents of the ocean, the tides near the coastline, and the wind. And often these forces are competing, and when these pans bump into each other, they crumple up. Now, often this is still happening. This environment is in a constant state of flux. And that, to me, is part of the magic of it. I knew, being out there alone, that the scenery I saw was unique to me. No one would ever see that, could ever possibly see that ever again. So that, to me, was part of the magic of this place. Although it didn't really seem that magical at times, it seemed hellish. You know, I realized with these big ridges, I couldn't pull both sledges. I had to pull one, go back, and get the other one. So I do 3 kilometers for every 1 kilometer north. NASA described the conditions that year as the worst since records began. We know for sure that the pack ice of the Arctic Ocean has become 40% thinner in the last 40 years, and the thinner it is, the harder things are for me, the more susceptible it is to being compressed and crumpled up. So some pretty tough conditions. And it's always moving. You know, I often think skiing is the wrong term. People sort of imagine that sounds nice, you know, sort of gliding along. It's like a giant assault course, giant jigsaw puzzle. You're trying to piece this crazy challenge together constantly. And it's always moving. The ice is always drifting. You know, I'd put my tent up and went to sleep at night. I'd always wake up somewhere different the next morning. And for 9 out of the 10 weeks I was out there, I was drifting backwards. The worst day came precisely 2 weeks into the expedition. I got up in the morning, packed my sledge, started heading north, and I was definitely heading the right way. When I stopped that evening, 8 hours later, I was 2.5 nautical miles, so 5 kilometers further south than when I started that morning. I still had, again, I need to look at my distances here, still had nearly 2,000 kilometers to go, and I'd done -5. So not the happiest evening in the tent. This is the view out of my tent, the little air vent. Fast forward another couple of weeks into early April, and the biggest challenge is no longer the ice, it's a lack of ice. By that stage, it's 24-hour daylight, the seasons are changing pretty quickly, the temperatures are rising, and the whole place is starting to melt. And you get reminders that you are walking over the sea. These cracks in the ice are called leads. Now, leads sometimes could be just a few centimeters across, you can jump over them. If I'm lucky, like this one, you get some handy little stepping stones floating around. If I'm unlucky, then it could be hundreds of meters across. I knew this was happening. I knew that water would be one of the biggest obstacles I'd face. So I had a secret weapon in my sledge called a dry suit or an immersion suit. We took this photo the year before, testing it out. It's completely waterproof. It's based on a sort of survival suit that perhaps helicopter pilots might use in the North Sea. It goes on over my boots, over my mittens, zips up the front, pulls tight around my face, and means that if the worst comes to the worst and I find leads that I can't find a route around, I can actually climb in and swim across them. Without doubt, the strangest and most frightening thing I've ever done. Firstly, polar bears hunt up and down these leads. That's where seals pop up. And it struck me rather too late in the day that I was wearing something very orange in a very white place. Secondly, I am armed for purely that reason. I have a gun strapped to the top of the sledge. But this suit they're like oven gloves. It's got these enormous mittens, and I'm wearing sort of 3 layers. So there's no way if a bear came along I could use my gun. So I've got to try and find the zip again, and So I was panicking before I'd even got to the edge, and then standing at the edge, the water just looks black, ink black. There's very little daylight coming through this thick ice. It's extremely deep. Again, in kilometers, it works out probably nearly 6-7 kilometers deep at the deepest points. So extraordinarily deep. As well as seals, it is home to killer whales, Arctic shark, which are one of the largest sharks. They're blind, which is good, but they track their prey by sensing movement in the water. So I'd sort of gingerly kind of sink in my suit and sort of backstroke across, and then pull the sledge over after me. It floated, but not well enough to use it as a boat. A huge innovation. If you told explorers of 50 years ago that I was expecting to swim part way to the North Pole. They'd have thought I'd lost my marbles completely. But it's an interesting example of how people are adapting to a very fast-changing climate. Another big innovation was communications. My very first expedition in 2001, we had HF radio, high-frequency radio, which is sort of World War I technology, useless, completely cut off. And I've gone from that to having a satellite phone, an Iridium satellite phone, which means I can not only phone people, but I can also send data back in very small amounts. I could send text, and I could send little photographs that are compressed down using this ancient, bought on eBay, this iPac, little palm-top computer that's the sort of precursor to iPhones and BlackBerries, that kind of thing. Crucially for me, it ran a very old version of Windows and confused the phone into thinking it was plugged into a laptop, and I could send stuff back. And this was 2004, so this was pre-Facebook, pre-Twitter, pre-social media. Very few people knew what a blog was, so it was my online diary. And I didn't really have high expectations, but we had 4.5 million people came to the site in 6 months. I was away for 3 months on the ice. Huge audience, and enabled some incredible interaction. I saw some polar bear footprints one day, and I was suddenly struck by this thought, which is, what on earth do polar bears drink? They hunt on sea ice for months at a time. It's averages -30, -40. There's no fresh water. Polar bears are mammals. Surely they need water to survive. Does anyone know what bears drink? I had no idea. And this embarrassed me, because I should be an expert, surely, on this place. So I posted this as a competition. I knew we had some schools following along, and we had nearly 500 schools responded to this competition. The answer, I always forget to say this, is that bears don't drink anything when they're hunting for months and months and months at a time. They have an enzyme in their stomach that is peculiar to polar bears. They break down fat in their diet. They eat seals, which are pretty blubbery. And that's how they get the water. Now, I never knew that. That was thanks to a school in Cincinnati who won this competition. I used to love going to the library with my mum when I was 8 or 9 and getting dusty books about Shackleton and Scott and Amundsen and Nansen. And now there's a chance for people to interact in real time. It's not all high-tech. This is navigating using a ribbon that would show me the direction of the wind, which is a technique that the Inuit use still nowadays. So there's a lovely combination of high-tech and low-tech. I got to the pole on the 11th of May that year. As I said, it took me 10 weeks to get there. There is nothing there. There isn't even a pole at the North Pole. I knew that. It's sea ice, it's moving. If you stuck a flag there, it would drift away. But I was still expecting something to be. It was like finding a bit of carpet on this floor. There's nothing to distinguish it. And I sort of counted down on my GPS the last few meters, and it was, in many ways, the ultimate anticlimax. There's nothing there. I didn't really know what to do. I hadn't planned this, so I pulled out my satellite phone. I thought, well, I'll phone someone, tell them I'm here. I called my mum, I called my girlfriend at the time, and I called the chairman of my sponsor, and I got 3 answer phones, 3 voicemails. I did eventually get through to my mum. She was in the queue at the supermarket. I could hear the sort of beep of the shopping going through the checkout. She said to the girl sat there, she said, "It's my son, he's at the North Pole." Silence. And then she said, "Look, it's a bit awkward, could you call me back?" And hung up. So I sort of sat on my sled, looking at my phone, thinking this isn't quite how I'd imagined this day, the sort of pinnacle of my life so far was going to pan out. Anyway, I'm running out of time, but I also ran out of time on this expedition. It was just getting far too warm towards the end. The ice really got too dangerous to continue. So I was picked up about 2 weeks into the Canadian side of the Arctic Ocean. I had to try and find an airstrip for a plane to land on, which was pretty nerve-wracking in these sort of conditions. My airstrip was actually about 50 meters shorter than I was told to find, but I didn't tell anyone that it was a bit short. So it was with great relief that this ski plane managed to land. I was quite worried when it did. The pilot I knew was called Troy. Now, I don't know if any Troys in the room, but I thought Troy was quite a tough-sounding name, and a Troy that flew ski planes around the Arctic, landing on floating ice for a living, was probably quite a tough guy, and would not be impressed if I was crying, which I was. So I had to really quickly sort of compose myself for Troy. And the door opened, the engine stopped, this guy jumped out. He was about that tall. He said, "Hi, my name's Troy." The co-pilot was a lady called Monica. They were the least macho people I've ever met. Troy said, just get in the back. Now, there was nowhere else to sit. Troy lit his big cigar. He climbed in the front with the cigar still glowing away. I thought the Russians were pretty special, but the Canadians outdid them completely in the aviation department. When we were in midair, this was a 9-hour flight, so an 18-hour round trip in this little plane. So the plane's full of fuel. This is highly illegal, I've learned, but you can get away with it in the Arctic. There was a guy called Rick who was refueling the plane in midair. You can see Monica looking worried. If I zoom in a bit, there's fuel, spraying around the inside of this plane. It was a pretty hair-raising journey. And one that left me with a profound, lasting impression, this sort of bird's-eye view, one that I certainly didn't get standing on the ice at sea level. Now, I often say that I'm not a raving eco-warrior. I'm sponsored by Land Rover. I drive a big car. I'm not wearing any hemp. I fly too much. But I am uniquely, I think, a layman with a sort of unbiased perspective who has been lucky enough to get to know this place at first hand for nearly a decade. And it is plainly apparent to me that things are changing profoundly and very fast indeed in the high Arctic. I'm going to touch on these 3 questions. Why? I'm not trying to find out where the North Pole is. I'm not exploring in the Edwardian sense. I am fascinated by human limits rather than geographical ones. So these expeditions to me are a chance to try and find out where my limits really lie as a human being. What is it that I'm genuinely capable of achieving when I really challenge myself? And I've consistently surprised myself. I'm not special in any respect. I don't have some sort of freakish genetic ability to withstand the cold. I'm not super fit. I'm not super intelligent. None of these things. I've just been peculiarly determined when it comes to this one goal. And I've become fascinated by potential. And it surprises me how many people go through their lives just scratching the surface of their own innate potential, just doing 3 or 4 or 5% of what they're genuinely capable of achieving. Now, I'm not advocating for a minute that you go and buy some skis and a sledge and do anything stupid like this, but I do believe firmly that A, we all have enormous innate potential as human beings, and B, that deep down everyone has their own North Pole, whether they've stated it publicly or not. I think most people have some sort of passion, some kind of big dream burning out. So I wanted to get people thinking about their own North Poles, I guess. How do you go to the loo? As quickly as possible. What's next? Very quickly, I'm trying to go back to the North Pole from the Canadian side to link these 2 journeys. It was a chap called Mallory, a British guy who tried to climb Everest back in the 1920s. He was disappeared moving into cloud towards the summit, so he may have climbed it. He coined the phrase, "because it's there," as the answer to the question why. Now, in my case, perhaps because it's there, but not for much longer, is the answer to the why question. This is a couple of satellite images showing the difference nowadays between what's called the maximum sea ice extent in the winter and the minimum. The difference in this minimum figure in the last 2 years is the equivalent of an area the size of France disappearing in the space of the last 12 months. So the scale of change and the rate of change in the Arctic is profound. Last of all, I'm heading to Antarctica at the end of next year to make a return journey, a round trip to the South Pole on foot. Again, no one's ever done it. In fact, it was the journey that Captain Scott and his team died trying to achieve back they died in 1912. It's the centenary next year. And there is this misconception that it's all been done nowadays. And it fascinates me that this is perhaps one of the last great unfinished journeys of this golden age of Edwardian exploration, and no one's done it yet. No one's walked there and back. So that's the plan. I think it's a good reason people haven't done it. It's 2,900 kilometers, the round trip. It'll take 4 months. It'll be the longest human-powered polar journey in history. You can find out more on my website. I want to leave you with one final thought. I have a school report at home, framed above my desk, aged 13. And there's one line that I like. It says, "Ben lacks sufficient impetus to achieve anything worthwhile." In some respects, of course, they were absolutely right. I'm still on my gap year. I'm still trying to figure out what it is I'll do when I grow up. But I think if I've learned anything in 10 years of doing what I do, it is this, that no one else is the authority on your potential. That's my story. Thank you very much.